Hello, everyone, and welcome to this exciting edition of the Mari Spring Seminar Series. Today, we have the great pleasure of welcoming Professor Mary Lewis of Reading University, who will share her research on the health and mobility of young people in medieval York. I'm sure you're all applauding in your respective homes, and I'm sure you're all wondering who I am taking up the airspace. My name is Veronica Jackson, as you can see from my camera, and I'm a fellow with the VUB's Makeup of the City project, which works in partnership with Mari. Similar to Dr. Lewis's York project, our work combines osteological, historical, and isotopic data to investigate the health and mobility of a medieval population, in our case, Ypres. Like York, Ypres was a major urban center and would have attracted people looking to participate in its booming cloth industry. And like Dr. Lewis, we believe in the importance of combining historical, archaeological, palaeopathological, and chemical data to study life histories, which is why we couldn't be more thrilled to have Professor Lewis join us today. In addition to today's subject matter, Dr. Lewis has had a long and prestigious career in bioarchaeology, literally writing the books on both the bioarchaeology and the paleopathology of children. Her body of work informs a seminal part of the Makeup of the City's approach, most notably the methods developed for assessing puberty in adolescent remains and the consequent insights into health in the past. So, without further ado, and with our utmost thanks, I would like to pass the screen on to Dr. Lewis.
Thank you, Veronica. That was a lovely introduction. I appreciate that. And yeah, I think our projects have all got very similar motivations and similar kind of questions, so it'd be interesting to hear what people have to say about it. So hopefully you can all see my screen now. Yes Good. Yeah, okay. So what I wanted to talk to you today about was is kind of mopping up some work that we did looking at adolescents in medieval Britain, and using the stable isotope data that we had for a group of children and teenagers from medieval York. So just to kind of give you a bit of background, so anybody who's not convinced yet that we should all be looking at adolescence, it's a unique stage of the human life cycle, and it encompasses things like the growth spurt and sexual maturation, puberty, and brain development. So there's so many things going on in these children at this time that it makes it a really interesting area of bioarchaeology to kind of explore. Adolescence is a major area of research in human biology and psychology and neurobiology and medicine. The literature is vast, but actually very little has been done in bioarchaeology to really explore this. And adolescence is complex and it's dynamic, it's culturally defined, and it's always an individual experience. So when I talk about adolescence, I incorporate individuals between 10 to 24 years of age. This is the WHO's interpretation of a vulnerable young person, where people are still finishing their growth and their psychological mental development and transitioning into adulthood. So for bioarchaeology, that's quite useful because that means we've got quite an expansion of our sample size. If we can go up to 25 years of age and incorporate those into our sample sizes, we've got a good body of people to look at. So I used to think about the biological teens. So they're the adolescence, which has the growth spurt and sexual maturation. There are both hidden stages of puberty and overt stages that we can see on the skeleton. Various other things are going on. So as a paleopathologist, what's interesting is that they're also undergoing a transition in their immune status. So children are moving from containing diseases to starting to attack diseases. And because they're transitioning in their immune status, we start to see chronic diseases reappear in adolescents that may have been contained by their body during when they were children. So we see today in the medical record, but also potentially in the archaeological record, increases in the prevalence of tuberculosis and leprosy, arthritis, Crohn's disease, colitis, and diabetes. All of these conditions have been associated with adolescence, and it's kind of the attacking immune system as opposed to containing and harboring the immune system. Also at this time, if we think about the medieval past and what people might have been doing, by the time children have gone through the massive part of the growth spurt towards the end of puberty, they're now capable of adult labour. And so it stands to reason that they would have started to work in the past, and they would have been doing adult forms of labour by that time. And previous research that I've done on adolescents from medieval York has shown that they're doing an awful lot of damage to their body at that time now. They're getting joint conditions and arthritic conditions. So we should be looking at these individuals in this way and looking for these kind of conditions that we normally associate with adults and degeneration. But also, you know, the girls are becoming fertile, and so we might find adolescents in our cemeteries as a result of pregnancy hazards. They're starting to get married and they're changing their identity. So I've said that their brain is changing, so they have suboptimal decision making and increased emotional reactivity. So they're pleasure seekers without really thinking through the consequences. And really, this is interesting if we're thinking about the way that people were reacting in the past and way adolescents were and the way that they were seen. They're also more prone to taking risks, which means they're exposed to violence and accidents. They're experimenting with drugs and sex and different types of activities. They're psychologically vulnerable, so there's higher rates of suicide. They're more likely to compare themselves and their development with their peers. And also they have a heightened sensitivity to physiological stress. So we should expect to see in our adolescents more stress indicators that we look for in bioarchaeology, as well as being more susceptible to psychological stress, which leaves them open to diseases such as schizophrenia, which become prevalent during adolescence. And we've seen also that as society becomes more and more complex, so as urbanization and industrialization take hold, there's this misstep between sexual maturation and psychological maturation that becomes ever increased as societies become more complex. And so adolescence kind of appears as this life course stage as we become more and more complex in our society, as it takes longer for individuals to acclimatize to being an adult in a complex world. But as I say, you know, that in bioarchaeology, teenagers and adolescents in particular have been neglected. It's very rare for adolescents to die today and in the past. And so skeletons of this age are quite limited. And probably we've neglected it because of the small sample sizes. But aging is probably the most accurate at this age because we're looking at very subtle fusion stages that occur over short periods of time. So it enables us to provide a more accurate age. And if we're thinking about migration, so I'm going to go on to talk about our evidence for what was going on with adolescent migration in York. Having kind of outlined what their physical and their psychological behavior is like, we're looking at people who are migrating at the time when they're most physiologically and psychologically vulnerable. So I think that adds an extra interesting dimension to the lives of these people if you think about what they're actually going through as they're developing. So there has been an increased interest in looking at youth migration in the past, and more and more papers are coming out employing stable isotope analysis to actually look in detail about who's moving and when they're moving. But I think it's still true to say that most of the work that's been done is on adult skeletons and looking at childhood migration from the adults themselves. And so you kind of miss this opportunity to look at the bodies of the adolescents and the bodies of the migrants during that short period of time when they migrated. So you can look at selected teeth to give you an age at which these people may have moved around. And normally, I mean, depending on which teeth you choose and teeth are available, you can look at movement between 0 and 14 years of age. So this is childhood movement. So on this slide here, you've got if you're between 0 and 3, if you're looking at the M1 and M2 and M3 can give you a long period of history of movement. And if you include the premolars, so premolar 1 and premolar 2 tend to reflect the development of M1 and M2. So depending on which teeth are available, you can look at different times at which people have moved. Now, we haven't done this in our data because it kind of predated some more recent advances, but people have started to look at incremental enamel and actually starting to say, well, we can say where somebody was when they were 3, and then we can say where they were when they are 7, and then when they were 14. So actually starting to look in more detail at how people moved. But if we're looking at migrants themselves and we're looking at adolescents and looking for signs that they've migrated in the actual adolescent skeletons, we have really direct evidence for the life of these young migrants rather than trying to extrapolate back from the adult skeleton to understand what they might have been like when they first moved as adolescents, really. So what I want to do is to present some new data that we have from medieval York, but it's not just about migration data, it's also dietary data and looking at their health in general. So we're looking at some environmental factors that were at play in York, and I think some of it is quite surprising. So really what I want to do is use the data and the information that we have on these children to test some theories of migration and ideas that we have about the visibility of migrants in the archaeological record. So I thought first what I would do then is kind of give you the background of that, and then we'll see where we can go with the data. So there were 5 theories of migration that Ravenstein introduced in 1885, and they're still considered very relevant today. So most people, the majority of people, will only migrate over short distances. Migrants who move large distances tend to move to much larger cities than the ones that they've come from. Whether males or females migrate depends on the local labour market. So if there's a strong labour market for males in their hometown, so for instance, I don't know, mining or something, then more females tend to migrate, and vice versa. If there's a strong female labour market, then it will be the males who migrate. So that all depends on the situation that they're leaving as to whether you get a different demography and who's moving around. In general, you have more rural to urban migration than you have people moving out of urban areas. And migration is of the youth. So the people who tend to migrate are young adults migrate. This is my age cohort, 15 to 24. So of course, this is the best time to start looking at the bodies of these individuals and looking for these migrants. And these are the groups of people who are moving both today and in the past. And the reason that young people move, it's because the people who move tend to be healthy. So this is a healthy migrant hypothesis that you won't get people who tend to be quite sickly or maybe disabled moving out of their hometown to somewhere else. Healthy young people move. They may return home when they become sick or when they get old and in their old age retire back to their hometown. This is known as the salmon bias, where they return home. And so migrants entering, say, for instance, going from a rural and entering an urban environment will have these kind of health benefits. So usually be healthier than most of the people living in the town that they've moved into. They're usually healthier for about 5 to 10 years. And then depending on the environment they've moved into and whether they'll be able to find work and feed themselves and all of that, that can last for 5 to 10 years, and then it can start to decline, really depending on the lifestyle that they discover when they get there. But all in all, children who move with their families are considered to be the really powerful ambassadors for families to integrate within the population that they've moved to. So what do we think about the archaeological evidence for migration and the way that it's being approached by archaeologists themselves? So based on modern theories of migration, we know that the size of the migrant group influences the visibility of that group within the archaeological record. So if you are a small number of migrants or an individual migrant, then you'll tend to de-emphasize your difference from the population that you're moving into in order to enable you to integrate. So your external dress, behavior will be acclimatized to the environment that you're in. Whereas if you have large migrant groups, so I'm thinking of these like European conquering populations that were going on in the past, in the early and later medieval period, in the Roman period, large migrant groups tend to be quite visible. So they will have visible culture, material culture, and they make less effort to integrate within the local population because they are the dominant population in many cases. So depending on how many people we're looking at who are migrating within certain periods of time during the past, we might expect to see different levels of visibility. And I think we do see that. You know, we see where we know we've got the Roman conquest, for instance, we do have a lot of Roman material culture that makes it obvious that something was going on at that time. So that's something to, can we look at visibility of our migrants within looking at our youth group from York? So were these young migrants keeping their cultural items, and were they expressing their difference in their burial rite and the people who were burying them? Are they from their migrant group, or are they integrating themselves and that they're not particularly visible in the archaeological record? Hemmer had suggested in 2014, based on extensive documentary research, that migrants tended to be buried in multiple burials when the normal burial practice is single burials. And this might be to bury them within the groups of other migrants and to kind of show that they are different in a way. So again, can we see anything like that at York? And I think, as I said, we hadn't really done the kind of incremental work on dental enamel and the dentine for past populations, because this was starting to develop when we were taking our isotopes. But Hadley and Hammer have shown through several case studies that people don't move from one rural environment and then go to an urban environment and stay there. Often they might move back to the rural environment, or they'll move from one urban environment to a completely different one. So by taking incremental enamel layers and taking isotopes from those enamel layers, you can start to see people who move when they're 3, and then move again when they're 7, and then move again when they're 14, and then die in a particular place. So it's a perpetual motion. So we shouldn't think about migration as being very static. And yet again, we're only really seeing the kind of the tip and the most simplified version of what's really going on in the past. But overall, this is what Janet would call the use of stable isotopes, in that it provides a kind of a chemical passport for your movement and people's movement in the past. So what about York? So York, we know, was a very vibrant area. It was one of the most important towns, urban areas, maybe a city a bit later on in the medieval period. And it attracted about 42% of people who were living there were migrants, but they were coming from quite short distances, so about a 20-mile radius. So this small scale movement might be invisible in the isotopic record, because you have to move from a geological area that is very different to the area that you're moving into. And within a 20-mile radius, you're normally going to get the same geology in that environment. So you're not necessarily going to see a difference between, I don't know, the teeth and the bones, for instance, that will tell you that somebody's moved. So a lot of this small scale movement that was probably the most common way of moving around in the medieval period will be invisible to us using isotopic studies. But we know from the documentary evidence that women and children were moving around. It wasn't just men. And also the documentary evidence is suggesting people are coming into York from further north in the country, from further afield in Europe, but also from Africa and Asia. And this shouldn't be a surprise. We already know from the Roman period that we have North African individuals living in York. So we, in a previous research that we've done at Reading, we had, I think it was about 11% of people from the isotopic work that we did were coming from places like North Africa. The average age of movement is considered to be between 18 and 19 years of age. So this is Goldberg's work looking at documentary evidence. So are we seeing that similar pattern of these adolescents moving around this age in our skeletal data? What we don't have, though, is documentary evidence for a lot of the poorer migrants. A lot of the information we have about migration in the medieval period is from individuals who are moving for apprenticeships, and we have apprenticeship records. And so a lot of the information is brought out again and again about these apprentices who actually had to be fairly wealthy. They had to know someone there, maybe a relative, or they had to pay for their apprenticeship. So the poorer migrants, maybe the adolescents who are moving to look for work with no family background, with no family wealth behind them, they're all also moving into these urban areas, but we have no documentary evidence for who they are, what age they are, how they lived, or anything about them, really. The only way we can get to that is through the skeletal evidence. Pelling had told us, and this is a bit later on, kind of the end of the medieval period into the post-medieval period, that there's lots of records of terminally ill apprentices going home. So this is where we're thinking about this salmon hypothesis in the healthy migrant kind of theory, that people who become ill return home. And we're certainly seeing that was what was going on in the medieval period as well. And previous work that I've done, just looking at purely the demographics of adolescent groups pre and post the Black Death in the medieval period, has suggested that there was limited rural to urban migration, really, and that this was restricted in that after the Black Death, the government produced an edict and a law that prevented people moving out of the countryside into the towns. There was lots of work to be had in the towns at that point, but they needed people to stay in the countryside in order to produce food to feed the towns. And so there were limitations to the age at which you were allowed to move. So it'd be interesting to see whether that's also showing up in the isotopic evidence, because it certainly looks like that was going on by looking at the demographic evidence. So I keep talking about a previous study that I did, and most of that research is published in this paper in Medieval Archaeology in 2016, a long time ago now, where I pulled together evidence for, I think it was about 6,000 adolescents and secondary and primary data. But really it opened my eyes to the power of looking at these skeletons and what they can tell us about their health, and they can give us lots of information about migration and behavior, their work practices, particularly comparing urban and rural work practices, their independence, how they were treated and how they were seen. They can express kind of social complexity. And you also need to start thinking about obstetrics with young mothers having babies and the impact that's having from one generation to the next, and their exposure to stress and violence. And for whatever reason, they may be having different levels of stress and violence. And again, by the time you can start sexing these individuals, you can look at the difference between the violence that and the kind of characteristics of the trauma that the males are seeing compared to the females, and then extrapolating that back. So that was a much larger scale study, but we collected data during that time on the York individuals, and that's really what I wanted to concentrate on. So we focused our stable isotope work on the York individuals. York has been an area of my interest of study for a very long time. The first sample was St Helen-the-Walls, which is one of the poorest parishes in the whole of York. It was a very crowded area. There's some suggestion that there's a lot of women working as prostitutes were there, so it's quite an impoverished area. And they're very near this industrial area of York known as Bedern, which is an old walk. Then we incorporated the suburban cemetery from Fishergate House, and a more recently excavated site from St Stephen's, which is actually a really early site. It predates the Black Death. And I hadn't really kind of comprehended this when we took the samples. It was a collection that had just become available, and we were offered the opportunity to sample them. So we did. But actually then predating the Black Death means that they're really interesting, and we can start to see some really interesting patterns going on with thinking about pre and post Black Death. So we had 157 adolescents in total for our York sample, aged between 10 and 25 years. And we took samples from 36 of those. So you can see St Helens is by far our largest sample. And I'd already recorded a lot of this data for my PhD. And then we have Fishergate House and St Stephen's. We just have, it's a smaller sample. So breaking this down, the majority of the individuals were males, and we had 25% females. So this is where they all are. It's a really big map. They're really spread out across York, so I've tried to condense it a little bit for you. So down here we have Fishergate House. So they are suburban. So this is kind of the big urban area of York. And so they're just on the outskirts. They date between 950 and 700. And we took 15 samples from the individuals down there. Then in the middle, we've got St Stephen's. So they're 900 to 1348. So just on the cusp of the Black Death. And we took 11 samples from there. So you can see they're quite near the castle. And then further up, right near the walls of the town, in this kind of really heavily populated industrial area, we've got St. Helen on the walls. So they're 950 to 1550, so much later, right? So we did a multi-analytical method. So we aged the individuals, we sexed the individuals after the age of 10. I'm happy to talk you through how we did that, if you want to ask that question at the end. And then we looked at puberty status as well. And I think this is the first time that anybody's taken stable isotope data and looked at the puberty status of those individuals as well. We included palaeopathology, so evidence for sinusitis and joint disease, infections and metabolic diseases that you might expect to be around at that time, but really looking at the health of individuals and whether these guys are migrating as well. Katie Tucker provided the evidence for St. Stephen's for their age and pathology. So we didn't actually look at those skeletons, we just took the samples. So I'm missing some data from them. And we sampled the first and second premolars and the first molar. So we can look at movements between 0 and 7 years of age. And we compared the dentine and the rib collagen, this is Janet, basically analysed carbon and nitrogen, oxygen, strontium and lead. And then we also looked at lead and strontium concentration. So we did as much as we could with the small samples that we had. And really, you're talking about tiny samples now of dentition in order to get an awful lot of information out of this material. So the idea is to have direct evidence for the identity, the diet, and the health of these York adolescents. So just to, because I can, because you're here, talk about the puberty method. We adapted this from clinical medicine, where there's a lot of research done on what areas of the skeleton are developing at different stages of puberty. And so we use the dental age of our individuals to compare skeletal maturation stages and for signatures of people being before puberty, then having their growth accelerating, so the onset of puberty, being at peak height velocity, where the body completely changes and becomes much more visually different, taller, boys become more muscular. It's a really important period of development. And then growth deceleration, where girls have their first period or menarche, and then maturation and completion, where you're practically an adult, at least physically you're an adult by that time. So we looked at lots of different features. So we looked at the development of the canine, development of the neck vertebra and the morphology of those, looked at fusion of the iliac crest, which is strongly linked to menarche, and also looked at the fusion of the phalanges in the hand, and things like the hamate has a little hook that develops as puberty develops. So we employed this method. So we didn't do this on St. Stephen's because we hadn't analysed the skeletons at the time, but we have some puberty data for the adolescents that are included in this study. So the key stages for this puberty are where you can start to see external signs of puberty, and people would start to recognise these individuals as being more adult and their ability to do adult labour, for instance. So at PHV, peak height velocity, for girls, they get breast development. Towards the end of their puberty development, they'll have their first period, and a couple of years after that, between 1 and 4 years, they can start having babies, get pregnant and have babies. For boys, their voice breaks at peak height velocity and they develop musculature. So they would start to look like adults and potentially be started to be treated differently. So when they die at this stage, I think it's quite an important factor that they're dying just as they're starting to almost pay back all the investment that they've had as children to actually start repaying through their work. Any delay in puberty will signal stress, and there's lots of records out there about the types of stress, psychological and physiological, that will delay puberty. And so looking at this delay can give us a new perspective on what's going on with these individuals. And in particular, things like peak height velocity in males today, when it's delayed, is related to chronic inflammatory diseases. So looking at puberty and looking at sex and age, we wanted to kind of have a holistic view of these individuals. And then, looking at their health as well. So we kind of recorded everything that we could see. So whether it's infections like tuberculosis or non-specific infections, respiratory infections like sinusitis, evidence for trauma, osteochondritis dissecans, which is trauma again. Osteochondritis dissecans and Schmall's nodes tend to occur in adolescence when you put your joints and your spine under a lot of strain. And, anemia, cribritalia, signs of rickets, more rib fractures, scurvy, and things like syphilis, treponemal disease as well. So we recorded all of the pathology that we could see. Right, so let's get to the stable isotope data. So I'm going to show you 3 different things that we looked at. So we looked at migration and then environmental exposure and then diet. So hopefully several of you are used to looking at these now. So I'll just explain the graph. So the hatched red line around, this is isotopic signatures for the York area that have been collected by soil samples and animal bone. For that area. So anybody who falls within that hashed line, they are considered to be local to York. Anybody who comes out of that hashed line, and we're being pretty generous with that, we consider them to be migrants. So up here we have quite high oxygen and quite high strontium, and that would suggest a cold environment. So we have one individual from St. Stephen's, so the blue St. Stephen's, they're coming from a very cold area. So we're suggesting Scotland might be a good place for them to come. We know people from Scotland were coming into York at the time. SK94 will come back to this individual again from St. Stephen's, but they're not as cold as Scotland, but certainly coming from outside of York. And then we have 2 more St. Stephen's individuals, and they're coming from slightly warmer areas. And we've got, I don't know the sex, so the question mark is I don't know the sex. These are males, that's a male. And then at St. Helen on the Walls, we have 1 female who's a migrant and a male who's a migrant. At Fishergate House, everybody, but this one person, I would say, is local to York at Fishergate House. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 individuals from St. Stephen's, 2 from St. Helen on the Walls, and 1 from Fishergate House, suggesting these are migrants from outside York. And so all but 2 of the individuals sampled from these later cemeteries, St. Helens and Fishergate, were local to York. These 2 individuals, though, who we discovered, one was was in a double burial. So remember what I said about visibility and maybe being buried slightly differently. So this male, he's about a 25-year-old male, 20 to 25-year-old, buried, but he was buried with a young female, and she was before menarche. So she's quite a young female, and they were in Fishergate House. So, but she's local. So you've got a migrant and a local woman together in a burial. And then the St. Helen on the Walls individual, who's a migrant, has or non-local, was buried inside the church, which suggests high status, and with tweezers. And there's lots of different ideas about what tweezers might mean for the burial environment, or whether they're just, functional. But all of these non-local individuals were quite old, so they were 20 to 25, so at the end of that adolescent period. But the pre-Black Death cemetery of St. Stephen's was much more diverse. So we've got a 18 to 20-year-old who we think is coming from Scotland or somewhere cooler, but they have a chest infection when they died and they fractured their finger. A 10 to 13-year-old from somewhere to the south of York, and he had a fractured, or they had a fractured skull. Then we have another 20 to 25-year-old male coming again somewhere from the south of York, but not York itself. And then St. Stephen's 94, a very interesting individual. You can go online and watch Janet talk about stable isotopes and talk about St. Stephen's 94. There's the skull itself. I hope some of you can see there are signatures here that this individual is of non-white ancestry, and we think she's a Black African girl. From the stable isotope signatures, it's clear that she came to York when she was about 8 years of age from a hotter environment. She was buried near the boundary ditch in this area, which I don't know that this is necessarily suggesting anything about her the way that she was accepted, because there were other people buried in that boundary ditch. The problem with St. Stephen's is I don't really have enough data on their burial to really go into any detail about that. So something to work out for the future. Okay, so that's migration. And then lead exposure was the other thing. Janet is particularly well known for looking at lead and looking at that in relation to migration. But we started to see some really interesting patterns coming out. So in this graph, I've got my hatched line is York again, and then I've got all these people who have concentrations of lead. So in the white box, these people have low levels of lead exposure or uptake in their skeleton. These will be preclinical, you wouldn't notice necessarily. Anybody in the red box, though, has got levels of lead in their system that would be consistent with clinical intoxication with lead. So becoming quite severe. And if you look over here, we have 3 individuals who are really at a very, very high level of lead exposure. This is my person from rural Scotland, my migrant. So clearly they're coming from a rural environment. They're not being exposed to any lead at all, really. And then somebody here, another migrant from St. Stephen's, is coming from a less polluted area in their childhood. So we've got one Fishergate person, who's quite badly exposed, but the main ones are St. Stephen's and St. Helen the Walls. And then we have these other 2 migrants, a non-local, and the suggestion is because they've got quite, 30 is clinical, because they're, on that kind of clinical stage of lead, they're migrating into York, but probably from another urban area. Whereas obviously this guy and this guy or person, they're coming in from more rural areas based on the lead, if you interpret lead like that. So this is the list of individuals with high lead. So we have very high levels of lead exposure in York. So St. Stephen's, this is our highest individual with 69.6, which is really high lead levels. They would have been visibly sick. It's associated, lead poisoning is associated with rickets and anemia. And in this case, we have the individuals with high lead levels, all but one, St. Stephen's 18, have signs of pathology, so rickets for the highest level, anemia, delayed growth, delayed maturation. Lead will take out calcium. It will kind of substitute, the body will substitute lead for calcium. So in the case of this child with rickets, they're 10 to 13 years of age, we don't know if they had rickets and that makes them more susceptible to absorbing lead because they've already got low calcium levels in their skeleton, or because they were so intoxicated with lead that they developed rickets. So we're not sure which way around it came, but there's a clear link between these two, and it's a link that's seen clinically as well. So we can see we've got migration of individuals under 8 years of age coming from rural and urban areas, and we're showing that by looking at lead levels. We can see there's rural migration into York and urban migration into York. But the pre-Black Death levels from St. Stephen's are really high, and it's unexpectedly high. So what's going on before the Black Death in these environments for have so many individuals from St. Stephen's having high levels of lead in their system? Anybody knows the answer to that question? It was a genuine question, don't know. And finally, we had our evidence for diet. So we have blue here, these are mixed, they're eating fish and other kind of vegetables and meat. And then in the green here, we have people just eating a terrestrial diet, so no fish in their diet. What's interesting, we don't have any Fishergate House data for diet, I'm afraid. What's interesting about the diet is that you can see almost entirely the St. Helens are eating a mixed diet, and the earlier pre-Black Death group, the St. Stephen's, are eating a terrestrial diet. There's one person from St. Helens eating a terrestrial diet, not touching fish. Maybe they didn't like fish, don't know. And then we have these people up here, 2 people from St. Stephen's who were eating fish.
It's wrong interpretation.
Yeah, I can hear you. You can ask me a question later.
Yeah.
So we have lead and rickets. So this is the individual with high lead levels and rickets. And then this is the individual with a gut infection. And they're here with this. They're the only ones that we have from the sample that we took that were eating fish. So what can we deduce from this? There's no evidence that the non-locals were eating anything different to everybody else. So there's nothing that stands out as a non-local diet. None of our migrants were eating anything that made us think that they were eating anything different. Most of the St. Helens teenagers had a mixed diet of plants and meat and fish, whereas St. Stephen's, the inhabitants had a mainly terrestrial diet. But at St. Stephen's, the two individuals, the 10 to 13-year-olds who did have fish in their diet, and obviously we only sampled 11 of them, so we don't have the picture for everybody living there, but it's kind of interesting that the only two that do had pathology. So the first one had, that was high lead levels with rickets, and they also had a leg infection, and the second individual had a gastrointestinal infection. So they would have been ill for some time. So to conclude then, the migration patterns before the Black Death were much more diverse than they were after the Black Death. So we have very limited evidence for migrations in Fishgates and St. Helens, but quite diverse evidence from St. Stephen's, including an African child who came to York when they were around 8, based on, they may have moved around a bit, but that's the evidence that we have from our stable isotopes. After the Black Death, it's consistent with the documentary evidence, suggesting probably more smaller, short distances and restricted movements. And the people who are moving then are older, so they're between 18 and 19, just as the documentary evidence suggests. They're slightly, well, they're between 20 and 25 from our data. So it seems to suggest that what the demographic evidence was showing me previously and what the stable isotope evidence seems to be suggesting is that before the Black Death, people were free to move around. After the Black Death in England, there seems to be something that is inhibiting people from moving from rural environment into the urban environment or moving around great distances. There's very limited evidence for any differential or multiple burial. We've got one double burial, but there's nothing really that suggests that our non-locals were being buried in a particular way. So they're invisible if we were just looking at the archaeological evidence. They also had a very similar diet to the rest of the York individuals, so we couldn't use diet as a way of looking for migration in York. And fish was rare in the early medieval York population. So at least from the sample that we took, they tended not to eat fish in St. Helens, in St. Stephen's, unless potentially they were sick. And so I was wondering why this might be. There's a lot of work done on medieval fish markets and stuff, but the fish market in York was thought to be in Ousegate, which is kind of in the middle of York, and it's equidistant from St. Helens on the Walls and St. Stephen's. Then you have the market in the middle. So if the St. Helens people are able to travel to the market to get fish, then why shouldn't the St. Stephen's people, even though it's easier, earlier be able to travel to the market to get fish? So, but they clearly weren't, unless they were going to get fish for these kids who were sick, and they were trying to, I don't know, help them by giving them a better diet. What happens in the later medieval period that wasn't going on in the early medieval period is evidence for the influx of preserved fish. So potentially, and I'm not an expert on fish, if anybody is, I'd love to hear your theories on this, that they had access to cheaper preserved fish. So they were getting fish in their diet because they were eating dried fish that could be stored. And so that's why the St. Helens people are getting access to fish, but the St. Stephen's people aren't. And we don't know what was going on in Fishergate, which is outside the town, a great distance from the fish market, because we don't have that data. But lead exposure was high in York, and particularly in the low socioeconomic groups, so St. Stephen's and St. Helens on the Walls, despite their different time periods. And since the St. Helens were in Bedern, in the industrial area, and St. Stephen's is kind of in the middle of York, it's still quite a built-up area. And lead would have been all around. So it would have been in the air, it would have been in the dust, it would have been on their hands, on their face. If they're eating food, they're going to be ingesting it. So it would have been everywhere, and they wouldn't have known that it was such a dangerous thing to have around in the environment. But so high that these people would have been clinically ill with the disease. Certainly a couple of the St. Stephen's individuals would be. But to get this kind of signature on only such a small number of samples really makes you wonder what was going on in York. And a lot of the work that I'd previously done looking into the documentary evidence of medieval apprentices and youth in particular is that they were fighting a lot. They had quite unruly behaviour. They were depressed. They were, just kind of out of control in some cases. And Janet and I were wondering whether how much this kind of lead intoxication, which does affect your behavior and your intelligence, how much that was actually impacting these individuals and contributing to the behavior of adolescents in medieval York. So I think there's a lot more to be done in looking at adolescents and lead poisoning and in the past and in these urban environments. So yeah, that was a kind of a whirlwind tour through that, and that's kind of all I wanted to say. But I'd love to hear any questions or any thoughts you might have about our data. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. To start off, do we have any people who have questions right away who are itching to get ready? I had a question about the lead intake. We're looking into that in the EPR population as well, because we have historical evidence that they had lead piping for their drinking water and everything with that. Yeah. And so I was wondering if you had any historical evidence for like sort of infrastructure that was made of lead, or like cooking pots or something like that, rather than
not for the medieval period, although I'll have to go back and have a look at that, and I'm sure Janet knows a lot. Janet does know a lot more about it than I do. So I'm not aware. I mean, that hasn't come up in our conversations that there were lead pipes. That we know that there were lead pipes in the Roman period, and a lot of work's been done on lead exposure then, but they weren't really using lead utensils by that time. The Romans were boiling stuff in lead, which was terrifying, but there's no evidence that they were doing that necessarily in York. So we don't know where they're necessarily getting these really high lead levels from, apart from Bedern, you know, if they're using lead for buildings and that kind of stuff. And so I think there's a bit more work to be done on where they're getting this lead from at such scarily high levels. So it'd be great to know what levels you get and whether they're on a par to that.
Yeah, well, we're very excited about that. Yeah. Well, and it's exciting that you got such a difference in the lead exposures, because we're a little concerned that all of ours might be similar across the entire population, and so then we can't make too much interpretation apart from just they had lead pipes, which we have in the historical documents anyways.
Yeah, so contamination from the environment is always a problem, so you're worried about that, but I think Janet's kind of sorted that kind of problems of contamination out. So we used to think all lead was just coming from the soil. Now we know that you can see differences. So yes, it's obviously not diagenetic, otherwise everybody would have the same levels. Yeah. I mean, I suppose with the rickets individual, it might be that they're really high because they were absorbing lead, but you're using the isotopes, which are telling you it's kind of anthropogenic lead rather than environmental lead that they're being exposed to anyway, whether that's in the soil in the medieval period or not. So.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you. Do we have any other questions towards the end of our time?
Yes, if I may. Wait, I'll turn on my video, that'll make it a bit easier. Thanks, Mary, for a really fabulous talk. So I did some historical research on long distance migration in the late medieval period, like mainly 15th century. And it was predominantly migration from the European mainland to England. And what we found was that there was quite like significant long distance migration also in the 15th century. And that in most English towns and cities, including York, you had levels of up to like 5, sometimes even close to 10% of the overall population that would have originated outside England, that would have been born basically, because that's a distinction that those historical documents make, that would have been born outside England. So in that respect, I found your conclusions remarkable, like suggesting that like what we would have found then would have been much less than in the pre-Black Death period. So that 4 to 10% might actually be like a minimum compared to the period before the Black Death. So found that quite remarkable. What we didn't find in the 15th century was any evidence of non-European migration. So people tended to come from all regions in Western Europe, neighboring countries, but also like further afield, Iberian Peninsula. But that was it. Like we looked at about like 50 to 60,000 individuals were recorded in those physical sources. And for none was there any indication of a non-European origin. So in that respect, that St. Stephen's is at 94 individual is also very, very interesting. I didn't know.
He's much younger. He's coming from a pre-Black Death cemetery.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask. Like, would you know, like, when has he been, like, what period has he been dated more specifically? Is it 14th, 13th, 12th century or earlier, or?
So it's before 1350, but I don't know any more than that. I don't know whether the stratigraphy of the cemetery is enough to be able to say more specifically. And they may have C14 dated them now.
Oh, okay,
they
might.
Quite famous, but I don't know. So have a look on that website, Janet's. If you type it in, it'll come up because there's a nice little video of it. I'm not sure that it's been C14 dated. But there's been a lot of work done in London on medieval London, again, around the time that you're looking, and they have found also Black Africans living in London at that time, which I suppose is not surprising. But there were definitely, whether it was commented on in documentary evidence is something else. The archaeological evidence is suggesting these people were around. It's only maybe later that you start to see them visibly in the documentary evidence, but they are definitely about. So I think there's some question about where she was born. You know, she may well have come from Europe, but was born in Europe. There's no reason why she didn't, you know, her parents didn't travel over to Europe and then she moved from Europe over. But I think the other problem is if the geology is the same, you know, there's large swathes of Europe that all have the same background geology. So you're not going to be able to be as precise. You can say they're coming from a colder area or a warmer area, but not necessarily exactly where they're coming from.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, if I may.
Of course.
Hi.
Hello, you spoke about syphilis. Did you add some cases of syphilis or no case in York?
Not in the York individuals, no. I found some, well, it's very interesting in London. So I'll just throw that in there. Well, when I looked at puberty and syphilis in London, and it was syphilis, not treponema disease, a lot of the girls who had it, more girls than boys had syphilis, and they were quite young. But it didn't delay their puberty. So I'm wondering whether they were, I mean, I'm talking about 6 individuals, which isn't a lot out of the thousands we looked at, but it's still quite a lot. But they were 5 of them were girls, and they were very young, and no delay in their puberty, which you might expect with such a chronic condition. So I wondered whether they were prostitutes and they were catching the disease that way, and that they looked adult because, you know, although it doesn't necessarily mean that they had to, but they were certainly not delayed in puberty, so they'd have looked like women, I think, at that time. So there is something very interesting going on about women in the medieval period, you know, and really looking at their health and the impact that's having then on generation after generation.
Thank you.
And anyone else? I feel like I could be just a little broken record playing that every couple of minutes. Okay, if not, I would like to extend our massive thank yous to Dr. Lewis. I'm going to put up a little thing on screen. Oh, hold on. My apologies.